All right. Call to order the May 13th, 2026 City of Boulder Open Space Board of Trustees meeting. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Um, we'll do a roll call. Board member, Trustee Zuckerman,
I'm right here.
Trustee Robinson,
Here.
Trustee Lomely.
Here.
Do we have Sarah with us?
We have to wait till she starts her video, but she's here.
Okay. All right, and Sarah's present. I'm present as well, so all five board members are here. With that, we'll move to approval of the minutes from the April 8th, 2026 board meeting. We'll go through one page at a time. Does anyone have any changes on the first page?
Thanks, John. On agenda item 1, OSPT officer elections. My recollection is that I made the motion to nominate the slate, and it says Morgan. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Any other changes on page 1?
No.
Okay. Page 2. Any changes on page 3? All right. Any changes on page 4?
No.
All right. Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the April 8th meeting?
I'll move that we approve the April 8th meeting minutes.
I'll second that.
All right. We have a motion on the floor that's been seconded. Take a vote. Trustee Zuckerman?
Yes.
Trustee Robinson?
Yes.
Trustee Lomely?
Yes.
Trustee Glenn? I believe you were absent last month.
Correct.
And then I'll vote yes as well. So that's 4 votes for with Sarah abstaining. All right, next up, we will move to public comments for items not identified for public hearing. I will note that there is a public hearing later in the meeting for open space related elements of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. So if you have comments on that, please hold them for the open comment that's going to come later in the meeting. But if you have open comments on any other topics, this would be the time to come and give your open comment. All right, Lauren, are you going to read the rules?
I will. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and OSPT, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement process, please visit the link provided. The city will enforce the rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code, including participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. No attendee shall disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of any city meeting in a manner that obstructs the business of that meeting. This also includes failing to obey any lawful order of the presiding officer to leave the meeting room or refrain from addressing the board. Only one person at a time at the podium, unless an accommodation like an interpreter is required. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No standing in or otherwise blocking the aisles in violation of the fire code or in a way that obstructs the vision or audio of other audience members. No signs or flags shall be permitted in council chambers except for one sign held by a person with the sign measuring no more than 11 by 17 inches, which is held no higher than the person's face. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. We ask that you not affix items to the podium or dais or walls or other surfaces of the chamber. Signs, flags, or other items used to communicate must be held by one person when displayed. Obscenity, other epithets based on race, gender, or religion, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the meeting will not be tolerated. In-person participants are asked to refrain from expressing support or disagreement verbally or with sounds such as applause or snapping, with the exception of declarations. Traditionally, support is shown through American Sign Language applause or jazz hands. If you are joining in person and would like to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing, please sign up at the table and we'll call you up to speak at the podium. If you are joining online, you can raise your hand to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing. You can do that using the raise hand icon or by clicking the participants icon, the 3 dots at the bottom right, and selecting raise hand. That's all. And we have one person signed up for public comment, for open public comment. And I don't believe we have any additional online at this time. So if Dorothy Cohen would like to speak, you can come up to the podium.
My name is Dorothy Cohen, and I've lived in Boulder since 1974. And I think the amount of bicyclists on open space is outrageous. I belong to a ski club, and we have after evening hikes. And one time I hiked down across from the Mesa Trail on South Boulder Road there, or it's not South Boulder Road. And we were just inundated by bicyclists. And the other day I was on Marshall Mesa, and the same thing. I had to constantly get over to the side. And I think the original intent of the open space was not for bicycles. I feel like there's way too many bicycles and they need to be limited. And the idea of e-bikes is also outrageous. And I just think that, we should think of the founders that started open space, of what they really wanted to be. And I just feel like, we're being inundated by bicycles. I almost feel like there's more bicycles than there are hikers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy.
At this time, there's nobody else signed up to speak. If there are any final requests to speak during public comment for folks online, you can raise your hand. And seeing none.
All right. With that, we'll close public comment. We'll move on to matters from the board. First up is trustee questions or discussion on written information items. Does anyone have any questions on the first item, agricultural land use assignment guidelines updates?
No. My read of that, there wasn't anything hugely substantive, which is why we're not discussing it as a board.
Yep, I had the same take. Just wanted to make sure no one else had anything.
Yeah. So no. Yeah, I just wanted to check in on that one. But yeah, I read it, and well, you're the one who noticed the change to the minutes. So what did you see when you read that part?
Oh, I was just actually going to say that I thought that the fact that the first page of the item talks about where you can find those guidelines online, and just the transparency of the process and the scoring system was all quite good. And I think if I were an applicant for ag use on open space property, I'd be glad to know how to make my application and what was preferred, and how I could score the most points. So I like that kind of transparency, and I thought it was well done.
Okay. Sarah, did you have anything on that one?
I did not, but no questions. I was happy to see that. I know that I think it really helps with the transparency. I know there are people who have wondered, I've heard wonderings about how the process works, and I like seeing this because it is very clear. So thank you for putting that together.
Thanks, Sarah. Second one, update on North Foothills Bikeway project. Any thoughts or questions?
It was nice to see the diagrams of the various alternatives, and it's an ambitious project. I just think it's important to understand that this is going to take a while, and there's a lot of funding that isn't in place yet. And just like the connector, yeah, just like other projects like this, it's going to take a long time, and that's just the nature of the beast here. I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that there is an opportunity for matching funds. And if people want to support this project philanthropically, there's something called the Coalition for Cyclists, which is a C3, which is a potential recipient of matching funds for the county's work on getting this funded. And I don't think many people know about that. I called the county up and just had a chat with them about this project. And so I thought that was something that the public might want to know about. Again, it's Coalition for Cyclists. But I drive that every day, and I am eager to see that first section completed where the majority of the fatalities have been happening. So anyway, thanks for the update in the packet.
Harmon? Oh, Morgan?
Oh, I just I thought some of the alternative, a lot of the physical work that is being reviewed now is, or the concepts that are being reviewed now have to do with some intersections and how we're going to handle them. And, there are flyovers and there are tunnels and there are at grade crossings that are all on the potential list of alternatives and the way to go. So I'm just curious as to sort of what our role, if any, is going to be, or if where we're going to be in a sort of information receiving mode on this, since this is mostly county money funding this, or if there will ever be like a POSAC OSBT combined meeting to talk about this, or I'm not advocating for that. I just John, if you don't mind, I might want to ask Dan what his thoughts are on how this process is going to go down the road.
Yeah, that's a good question in terms of the role of boards when it's perhaps we alluded to in the memo that it's way too early to tell, but based on when design starts to get more detailed, that there could be a situation where it might require a transfer of ownership interests or something that would trigger a disposal. Obviously, the board would be brought in at that point in time. So for right now, I view it as sort of an informational sharing. There are community engagement opportunities that are ongoing. But yeah, Joshua, I don't know if you feel differently, but feel like for right now, it is pretty much an informed opportunity for you. But certainly as we put information in front of you, if you see something you want to elevate it for a discussion, happy to bring in staff to help support that.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea of a joint meeting about it at some point. I mean, it's a huge project of great import when the time is right, and that could be in years. But like I said, I had a conversation with somebody at the county and learned a lot about it in addition to the packet.
Morgan?
Yeah, in general, it's like a highly critical project. Cyclists don't ride that road because it's terrifying, and I think it's a wonderful recreation and transportation opportunity. So that's that. Also, generally speaking, I think POSAC hasn't been meeting as much. I've read some things about that, and it's not under the purview of this group whatsoever. But I think that's something POSAC should be carefully engaged in too, and I would support a joint meeting. Dan, is it right that the city's more of a cooperating partner and the county's the lead?
Yeah, the county is definitely the lead for the project in terms of project, but it is set up. It's got a nice project structure to it, and then so there's levels of involvement with subject matter experts. We have, I think, two different committees, I think they're called, in which our staff are part of. And then there's also a leadership or executive committee. And we have City of Boulder leadership on the executive committee as well. And that's with, Town of Lyons, Boulder County,
CDOT?
CDOT.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes, the project has a governance structure where there are different tiers of involvement. And that's what Dan's referring to. At the OSMP level, we have our staff involvement with the project leadership team, which is the county, and other consultants and other folks at that same level of expertise at the staff level. And then when issues or higher levels of detail are needed, that gets elevated to the next tier of the governance structure. So that's where those conversations can happen.
Okay. That makes sense. I would either like to be directed to something online that shows the financial projections for it and specifics around where city property is. The map that's in, I mean, these are great maps and great schematics. I'm curious where we would cross city right away, where the path would.
That information does exist.
It's online, yeah. I
We can
bet.
provide that.
Would it
Okay.
be in previous touches with the OSBT as far as, so the vast majority is in CDOT right away.
Mhm.
There are a couple of points, and we've circled them in the past, of where it may need to deviate from the right of way and go on to open space lands. That's where we're concentrating. So there are a couple of areas where that might happen, and I think we put some memos together for you in the past that shows that,
Okay.
and we could forward you that memo that shows that type of detail.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more. And I just, again, would like to be involved. I mean, by virtue of the fact that you're on some of those leadership, in some of those roles, I think OSBT should stay engaged.
Okay.
Thank you.
And could you remind us if it does have to deviate from the CDOT right away, would we have to dispose of that land?
That in and of itself would not trigger a disposal, because recreation use is an open space purpose, and obviously supporting bikes, in which pedestrians can be on it too, would be an open space purpose. So just because the bikeway would be on open space would not trigger it. There are some other nuances as we get into other detail of where we would want to, where it might trigger, but it's way too early to tell on that one yet.
Would we run into any issues with our e-bike rules and what, they may want to allow on the trail?
That could possibly be one. Those level of details has not been vetted or worked through yet. But for instance, if there was something where the decision was made that class 3 would be on this, the city and open space does not allow class 3 on the trails. So that would be a situation where we would have to look at, okay, what alternatives exist here? But we're not at that point yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that I think we need to be involved in, or we will be involved in down the road, is if, let's say, the pathway has to stray outside of the CDOT right of way and it's got to go on some open space land, do we want to convey some sort of interest? Do we want to give the county, so we don't have fragmented jurisdiction where OSMP has to go out to a place that's just this big on a long trail and patrol that little section? Do we want to have a memorandum of agreement with the county whereby, they have jurisdiction over the whole trail and we give them a license for that portion, or we give them an easement, or, those kinds of things have been interpreted to require a disposal, even if we're not just actually giving up any land. So, I mean, I think that's stuff we talked about in the last time that we had that in front of us, and it's in the packet that you're probably going to get shipped out, Morgan. So just keep an eye out for that, I think.
Sarah, any thoughts on this one?
I don't have anything substantial to add. I'm a North Boulder person, and I do like talking about recreation in this part of town. A lot of the time we're talking about Central and South Boulder, so it's nice when we're talking about things that are happening up here. But other than that, I have nothing to say. I'm in full support. I'm excited to see this take place when it does.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I'll add, I feel like we've been getting updates on this, since I started on the board 4 years ago, and it's been really exciting to see this progress to the point it's at. So thank you for the update. Any other matters from the board or anything anyone wants to bring up?
I saw that our board resolution went to council officially, and is that correct?
I do believe it went to council.
I think it went early this
Am
week.
I mumbling? Sorry. Our resolution that we passed last time went to council, and could you all are we waiting with bated breath to see what they say?
I mean, I don't believe they've met since it was delivered. Is that correct?
It was delivered, I think, early this week or late last week. So their first meeting would be tomorrow night.
Yeah.
It is a budget-related study session. It's possible that if it piques somebody's desire to say something, tomorrow night could be a night for that.
Okay. And it's a study session with no public hearing.
That's right. It's an alternating week, so the next business meeting would be the following week.
Okay.
But it's all, so yeah, in relation to that, tomorrow night's going to be an interesting meeting. It's financial forecast, some new where the city's sitting in terms of financial situation, and then the ballot measure conversations would be the last half of that study session. So some of the interest that you all had in previous
including
meetings.
the public realm sales tax consolidation would be covered in that meeting.
Yep. So sort of more strictly kind of budget stuff first half, and then ballot measures second half of
Okay.
tomorrow night.
Thanks, Dan. Any other matters from the board?
Nope.
All right. With that, we'll move on to the public hearing in consideration of a motion to approve the open space related elements of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. As a reminder, there's going to be a presentation from staff. The board will have an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. Then we will do public comments, and then we'll do deliberation and recommendation after public comment. So, yeah. I'll turn it over to you,
Great.
Dan.
Well, we'll bring our team up, and that's going to consist of, you've already heard from Joshua already tonight. Joshua is our principal planner from Open Space and Mountain Parks, and we're joined by Christopher Johnson with Planning and Development Team Department, and the Comp Planning Senior Manager is Christopher's title. And we were joking about a good trivia question would be is how many night meetings did Christopher need to do as part of the BVCP process? So he said he doesn't know yet, but it'll be a future trivia question for us all. But this is our third and final touch in terms of the open space elements with this board. And Joshua and Christopher will sort of walk through what the next step is beyond this meeting. But this is your opportunity to provide any final feedback. And as I alluded to in an email to you all last week, that your final comments should be in the form of a motion, because this is your time to make a recommendation. So with that, I think I'm turning things over to Joshua first.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. As Dan mentioned, my name is Joshua Schnabel. I'm a principal planner at Open Space and Mountain Parks, and I'm joined tonight by my colleague in Planning and Development Services, Christopher Johnson. He's the Comprehensive Planning Senior Manager with that group. And tonight, our purpose is to provide the board with a final update to the open space related components of the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, answer any questions from board members, and assist the board with making a formal motion. This is, as Dan mentioned, the third and final touch point we'll have with you. We provided updates at 2 points previously, once last September, and then again in March of this year. And tonight we're requesting a motion on the open space related elements of the plan. That motion from the board tonight will serve as part of the formal plan adoption process through a recommendation to the city's planning board and city council. So to support this, through our presentation tonight, we'll be providing an overview of the process involved in completing the plan, an update on specific areas of the plan with relevance to open space, and a draft motion for the board's consideration. Here's that proposed motion language. This was also provided in your meeting packet, and we'll come back to this slide later when we request the motion. So let's dive right in. starting with a quick overview of where we are today in the major update process. Just as a quick refresher for everyone, since we know we've heard this a few times, the comprehensive plan is a document that guides land management and community change within the Boulder Valley. Importantly, it contains specific policy statements and a future land use map. And this is the 8th major update of the plan. Here's a helpful visual with some time frames. We're now in phase 4. It's called A Boulder Future, and this is where the plan is prepared and adopted. A preliminary draft of the plan was posted for public comment on March 3rd. The public engagement window closed on April 6th. Since then, the comp planning team, that's KJ's group here, has worked alongside various city departments, including OSMP, to incorporate public input on the draft and to finalize the plan. The recommended plan will be posted on May 18th and made available to the community in advance of public hearings occurring in June. So tonight, we'll give you an update on specific elements of the plan that have relevance for open space, and those are listed here. These 5 points are definitions of the open space and greenways land use designations, which are displayed in the updated future land use map, the revised open space related policy statements that now appear in the plan, an updated description of regional connections, which was previously called the trails map in the comp plan, and updated descriptions of open space and agriculture in the Boulder Valley. And since the future land use designations element is central to the comp plan, we'll start with that. Here's a visual that you've seen before. This is the way land use designations now appear in the updated comprehensive plan. This major update includes 12 unique designations across 5 classes, whereas the prior comp plan had 26. You'll see the 2 land use designations of open space and greenways with stars next to them. These 2 designations have particular relevance to open space, and these appear under the new systems classification in the updated plan. So let's start with open space. For this major update of the plan, there is only 1 open space land use designation, whereas previously the plan contained 3 separate land use designations for open space. Those 3 open space designations were open space acquired, or OSA, which applied to land already acquired for open space purposes, open space development rights, OSDR, which applied to privately owned land with existing conservation easements or other development restrictions, and open space other, which applied to other public and private land designated prior to 1981 that the city and county wanted to preserve. By itself, however, this designation did not ensure open space protection. The updated BVCP now contains a definition of open space, shown here, that is broad enough to include those lands that would be classified under OSDR, along with the acquired lands previously classified as OSA. And the definition was broadened in response to board feedback that we received. So this new definition states, open space consists of lands maintained for specific purposes, which are listed here, administered by the city, county, other public entities, or nonprofits, either through direct ownership, conservation easements, or other contractual obligations. And privately owned sites may contain development, but still contribute to the community's open space values by terms of existing agreements. So I won't belabor this too much because we've covered this during our last update to the board, but here's just a quick refresher on how those 3 open space classifications were handled for the update. So OSA still becomes open space, and features with the OSDR classification are also added to the new open space land use designation. As for the OSO designation, that's been removed and the appropriate land use designation is applied in its place, except for a few rare instances where OSO polygons were actually representative of current acquisitions or existing contractual obligations, in which case those were brought under the new open space designation. Additionally, a new land use designation of greenways is being added for this major update to the BVCP. The new greenways designation, as its definition currently states, will apply to areas adjacent to natural urban waterways within city limits including Boulder Creek and tributary streams that help manage and mitigate flooding, support multifunctional landscapes and ecosystem services, and protect cultural resources. Importantly, as it pertains to open space, although greenways overlap some open space areas, open space land is still a primary component. So greenways can also offer recreation and active transportation, but the designation itself does not imply access, and open space charter purposes would still apply to lands with the greenways designation. And so now to illustrate some of all of this that I've been talking about and kind of bring it home, I'll turn it over to KJ, who will share some points about the updated future land use map.
Thank you, Joshua. Good evening, trustees. Thank you for hosting us once again this evening. We're excited to be here. We are moving ever so closer to the full adoption of this plan after about a 2-year process. We started back in October of 2024, so we are very excited to be at this point. Next slide. So as Joshua mentioned, the new future land use strategy or framework is then applied to the map, and the future land use map really establishes the vision for urban and rural environments in the Boulder Valley and is used to manage change over the time horizon of the plan, which is a 20-year time horizon. You can see here on the screen is an image of what the future land use map looks like. It was posted to the project website back on May 4th. You can also see the legend of the different classes and the 12 designations under each of those. As I mentioned, the digital version of this map was posted to the project website back on May 4th, and there was a link in your memo packet so you could go to that. The good thing is the functionality of that online version of the map is you can zoom in and out. You can enter an address to zoom in on a particular property if you're interested. And I'll just draw your attention to the distribution of the new single open space designation that was simplified from those 3 categories down to 1. You can see that that comprises really the majority of the land use application across the Boulder Valley. And also the greenways designation, which is new and really intended to recognize the importance of those corridors through the urban environment. You can see that little inset map as an example where a portion of that greenways land use designation overlaps with open space. That's an area that's just west of Baseline Reservoir, and that's aligning with a portion of South Boulder Creek. Next slide. So I'm going to transition from the future land use map and the designations to policies. So the policies in the comprehensive plan really then provide the guidance and the direction for achieving the plan's vision over that 20-year time horizon. Currently, the comprehensive plan that's in place today has 210 policies that address a wide range of topics and community values. However, through this process, including input from community and from boards and policymakers and city and county staff, indicated that those 210 policies, there were many instances where those policies were either duplicative or they contradicted each other. Could have been repetitive of policies that are captured in other plans, either department plans or other plans that are administered by either the city or the county. And so with that in mind, the approach really as the team moved forward with this process to update the plan, we aim to make those policies clear, simple, and resilient. So through this process, all of the existing 210 policies went through a thorough evaluation and a series of reviews with department subject matter experts, including staff and leadership, to identify those policies that could either be edited or combined or removed entirely, just to reduce some of that complexity. We wrote these policies, the new policies that are in your packet and ultimately will be in the recommended plan, with an eye toward achieving a 10th grade reading level. We initially aimed for 8th grade, but it's really, really difficult as you get into a technical document to achieve that. So we're aiming for that 10th grade reading level. The policies also were very intentionally developed to serve as broad aspirational guidance for the next 20 years and really explaining what the policy is and why that's valuable to the community. And what they don't do is provide really kind of detailed operational language around how to implement that policy. And that's really intentional to make sure that the city can remain nimble and flexible and apply different approaches as those conditions may change over time. The updated plan that you will see that will ultimately be posted on May 18th and includes all of the recommended policies is now only down to 104 policies. So just under half of what's in there today. This is the list that have particular relevance to open space. You can see there's many of them. They're organized here by the policy number in which they will appear in the recommended plan. This was also included as an attachment in your memo packet, so hopefully you've had an opportunity to read through these. As you can see, many of these policies do relate to open space in one way or another. Some are more direct, some are a bit more tangential. There's 37 policies that are represented here, so about a third of the overall 104 in the plan. And this is essentially the same list that was provided back in March at that initial review that we had. I will just draw your attention that some of the numbering may have changed. We did reorganize some of the policies just to create some better navigation within the document itself and clustering topics together. And also just to emphasize that the numbering does not relate to priority in any way. It's just a helpful navigation tool. So really the main point here is that OSMP staff have worked really, really closely with the planning team to incorporate the feedback that are received from this board back in September at our first meeting, and then most recently in March, the input that we've received from the community that's had relevance to open space. The staff have reviewed multiple rounds of draft policy language over the last several months and offered many revisions and suggestions that have been incorporated into our recommended plan. And then really most importantly, ensuring that all of the policies are aligned with the, sorry, I lost my notes, are aligned with the open space charter purposes and making sure that the policies themselves really accurately reflect the management responsibilities held by the department and by the Board of Trustees. One final note I'll just mention is that as I've mentioned just earlier, is that the full recommended plan is going to be available on May 18th. We worked really closely with staff and leadership to really front load all of the revisions to open space policies so we could make sure that that got into your packet and was accurate. So what is included and what you have reviewed, what we're discussing tonight, is the final version. There could have been a few minor word changes or clarifications made in the last week that would not be in your packet, but nothing substantive, no intent has changed in that. And so what you see tonight is what will be represented in the full recommended plan on Monday. So the update also contains general direction around planned and desired regional trail connections. So this was previously known as the Trails Map, and this has evolved into what we're calling the Regional Connections Plan. So I'll just pass it back to Joshua to cover this.
Thanks, KJ. So as you may recall from our last update, the Trails Map contained in the previous comp plan, which is shown here on the left, illustrated the proposed trails and trail connections for the entire Boulder Valley. That map served an important role in the comprehensive plan, which was to guide ongoing and future regional planning efforts. However, the map depicts an unnecessarily granular level of detail where the full range of OSMP trail categories and system reroutes is being shown. And so simplification of the map was needed to better identify the agreed upon regional connections, both planned and aspirational, that have occurred through interagency collaboration. These regional connections are shown here in the updated graphic, which you see in the middle, and they're in sharper focus. They're called out specifically by name. This updated version removes those extraneous details and presents a clearer picture of the regional interagency collaborative efforts that are happening. Specifically, planned connections, which have been developed through this interagency collaboration, are shown in solid arrows. These are connections that have been developed to at least a minimum level of preliminary conceptual design, while desired connections, shown as dotted arrows, remain at the visioning stage. Several regional mobility connections are formally recognized in this major update as well, and those are shown in blue. And these include the Northwest Rail Front Range Passenger Rail Connection, Colorado Highway 119, Highway 7 and Highway 93 mobility improvements, US 36 Boulder to Lyons safety improvements, and the South Boulder Road mobility improvements. Regional trail connections, which are shown in red, indicate a general direction for potential connecting trails. In most cases, specific alignments or trail corridors have not yet been selected. However, the concept for the trail connection itself is supported by the city and the county. And it's worth noting that this map doesn't include existing or completed regional trails. So it's not a complete map of our regional network. It's one that's focused on these areas of collaboration, and that's the purpose we're intending to serve with this. As these connections are completed, they will be removed from the map at future updates. And lastly, this major update to the BVCP will also include updated descriptions of agriculture and open space in the Boulder Valley. And those updates were made in response to community input that we received during the draft review period, including community feedback received during last month's OSBT meeting. And you'll see that here, and it's also contained in the memo, a 2-page spread describing agriculture and food systems in the Boulder Valley. This now appears in the updated plan. And this updated text was included in response to input the team received during public engagement for a review of the draft plan. And the narrative here now includes more details about the diversity of agricultural operations and how OSMP contributes by providing agricultural leasing programs that support local farms and ranches. The section also highlights the important role that agriculture plays in the cultural heritage of the region. Similarly, a more in-depth description of open space in the Boulder Valley has now been incorporated into the plan as a 2-page spread, which you see here. This description also occupies the same level of prominence as those other topics within the plan. And this description that you see includes an overview of the role of open space, language highlighting a few salient features of the open space system, including why it matters, and descriptions of broad focus areas that guide the preservation of open space. And so those are the main components of the updates to this plan. And now we can address any clarifying questions from the board, either on this presentation or on the memo that you received. But we thought first it'd be helpful to provide this timeline to put all of this in perspective. So as we mentioned, this meeting is our opportunity to request a formal motion on these open space related elements of the BVCP. And a motion from the board tonight by making a recommendation to Planning Board and City Council will serve as part of the formal plan adoption process. Those entities, Planning Board and City Council, are scheduled to hold a joint public hearing and review of the recommended plan and future land use map on June 4th. So now let's open it up to any clarifying questions from the board. And then we could probably move into public hearing after that.
Thank you. Does anyone on the board have clarifying questions?
I do not.
Oh, all right. No clarifying questions. I think we can move to public comment.
Great. So we have one person who signed up in advance online, and that's Alan Delamere, followed by Karen Hallwig. If anybody else would like to speak, if you're online, you can raise your hand, or in person can come up to the dais here to sign up. So Alan, I am unmuting you now, and you should be able to speak.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Good. Solar farms are the thing of the future. Do you have any consideration of allowing solar farms on our open space land?
I'm sorry, Silver Farms? Solar farms. Would
Solar.
solar farms be allowed on open space? Yeah, keep going. We can't ask questions during your testimony, but we can follow up once you're done with staff. Alan, are you still there?
Alan, if you have
I'm
any
still here.
Alan, if you have any additional public comment, we can make sure we get through your thoughts before we
No,
address your
that's my
question.
one comment.
Okay.
Apart from, of course, my favorite topic of fire mitigation, which doesn't seem to be included yet.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ellen. We'll talk about that after comment here.
Great. And next up is Karen Holwig.
Thank you. I'm Karen Holwig, and I'm speaking for Plan Boulder. Thank you to open space staff, planning staff, county staff for generating this new version and for accepting so many comments that have been made by the public. Plan Boulder has been working on and commenting on Boulder Valley Comp Plan for almost 2 years now. And I want to I sent you all a copy of my statement, but I want to emphasize some things in Appendix A and Appendix B, which are clarifications that I hope you'll be able to accept in this. I don't think they significantly change the meaning of anything, but they certainly clarify, in my opinion, some of the statements. On page 6, in the third sentence, it says open space properties are not typically intensively developed. I'm not aware of any subdivisions or office parks on open space land. And I think it might be more accurate to say are free of urban development in that case. In the green box, I think it's really important to distinguish between open lands, which is a term that's used for the Greenways program, and natural lands, which is a term that I think would better be used for open space. So in the green box, I'd like to replace open lands with preservation of natural lands. Then on page 7, I think in the first bullet, it's important to add a sentence that says something like large swaths of unfragmented natural lands are preserved without public access to enable populations of native species to thrive and ecologically function in biological communities and sustain themselves. Then in the first bullet under mobility, I think the access for trails is in some open space lands, not all open space lands, and that's an important distinction. And if we're striving for 10th grade reading level, maybe instead of utility operation, which I'm not sure what that means, it might be more useful to use something like manage and mitigate flooding. In Appendix B, we'd like to suggest some revisions that are basically, there are 3 of them that are similar, but to distinguish, again, open space and mountain parks, natural lands that are intended to preserve native ecosystems against greenways, which are open lands where increased native and non-native biodiversity are encouraged by the city staff. And I think those distinctions should be made in policy 32 and 36. And finally, in policy 34, climate action, I think for climate action, the city both intends to reduce production of greenhouse gases and support the health of our natural open space lands that sequester the greenhouse gases. Both of those functions are important in my mind in terms of climate action. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Karen.
This time there's nobody else signed up for public comment.
Okay. With that, we'll close public comment and move to deliberation and recommendation. When the board has thoughts.
I have a general question for staff, and you'll forgive me, but help me understand a typical scenario where you use the comp plan to manage your programs, your projects, your day-to-day.
Okay, did you want to give an example overall of like how you would tell council that, and then maybe we could point to some open space specifics?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most appropriate. So broadly speaking, the comprehensive plan really guides many of, if not most of, the city decision making around programs and services. So it certainly is. It is used when council is considering a policy change around if we are updating the zoning code to allow different uses in different areas of the city. References to consistency with the comprehensive plan are part of that approval process. There's specific more on the planning and development side of the shop in terms of individual development projects that are going through a discretionary site review process. Those have to show that they are in compliance with the future land use map and with the comprehensive plan. I do know that, other departments then have more detailed either departmental or program specific plans, and each of those is sort of crafted in consistency with the comprehensive plan and then flows down into more detailed operational decisions and actions. So yeah, Joshua brought up a good example or a good diagram that sort of shows how the comprehensive plan sort of sits within the umbrella or the framework of all of the work that the city does and sort of translates into those day-to-day decisions. So there certainly are things that and processes where the comp plan is used very directly, those things that I mentioned in terms of policy choices or development review applications. There's other things where the comp plan is just influencing individual department decisions, annual work plans, other things like that.
Christopher and Joshua, on behalf of SMP, do you find that it helps you do your job or makes it more complicated? And the tone of your description of simplifying the definition of open space and reducing the number of policies sounds like it was favorable to you all and helps you. But are you on behalf of staff happy with these changes, or were there anything?
I can
Yeah,
speak a little
please.
bit to particularly the clarification around regional connections. That's one area of the plan. It's just one example where that level of nuance now really comes forth in the major update. Whereas previously, you had every trail reroute being shown on that map. Now we have something that can really guide and provide a foundation for collaborative efforts going forward. And so interagency work can proceed with that sort of goal, with that sort of North Star, if you will, from that graphic and from that description of planned and desired future regional connections. So in that sense, the comprehensive plan really serves as this guiding work. And it is comprehensive planning. It's not down to the nitty gritty details that you'd find in department level plans, but it does inform those plans.
So last question, but knowing it's something we need to live with and follow, it doesn't prevent you all from doing the work you need to do, and the simplification is welcome.
No, exactly. I think it should dovetail. That's the intent. It should dovetail with the work that the department's doing.
Okay, thank you.
I will ask, there was a member of the public that asked if any of these changes would allow solar panels on open space land.
Not changes per se, but I think you can speak
Yeah,
to the.
typically we have not provided any permits for solar farms on our property. But if I would say if a solar array or a solar farm or solar structures were essential to helping us carry out an open space purpose, I could see a situation where as long as that improvement was made under the charter definition of where improvements could be done according to be essential for managing for agricultural uses or managing our natural lands or for recreation. And then that we could link that improvement to an open space purpose. But in and of itself of just having energy production on open space, that is something that would not be permitted right now. And this comprehensive plan does not change that.
Any other thoughts? Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciated the comments from Plan Boulder and the detailed review. Thank you for that, taking the time to do that and bringing that to us here. One of the things that I was curious about in terms of fire and flood and basically mitigating climate impacts is do we feel like we have been thorough and forward-looking enough here in order to support these objectives as we continue to receive inquiries and some at times heated and passionate inquiries from the community, and at other times just like in our ongoing effort to really be doing our very best to play our role within the city in this regard? Have we covered that? I will admit that I've read this and I've participated in these conversations, but it is such an enormous document, and I'm currently, given my state undergoing these treatments, my brain isn't fully absorbing. So I'm asking it as a question rather than making a statement there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm happy to try to explain or provide some additional information. So, unfortunately, one of the things that's limited within your memo packet is that it does include all of the specific open space related items, but it is not the entire plan. So what I can tell you is that, that you will see on Monday, May 18th, the plan does include a 2-page topic spread that speaks directly to resilience and living with natural hazards. So that includes wildfire, but also includes flood, extreme heat, other climate related impacts that we're managing. There's also a number of specific policies that speak to resilience and preparedness for natural hazards and climate response. So from the comprehensive plans standpoint, I do believe that we have covered this sufficiently. This was certainly an area of very high interest from the community, and so we've tried to be very responsive to that and include that information in the plan. We've had a lot of interaction with our fire department and others in that space, but certainly there is more to do just in terms of as we implement the plan and looking at further regulations in the wildland urban interface, thinking about flood regulations and other things like that. So there is absolutely work yet to be done, but from the policy perspective and really capturing the values of the community, I do think that we have that covered in the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, specifically policies 47, 88, and 89, Sarah, speak more directly. 89 speaks very directly and specifically to being a fire adapted community. So there's a policy centered on that, as well as 88, the one right before it, which speaks to disasters. And then floodplain management on 47 speaks to some of the flood mitigation work that the city does.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. That was my only question, or I guess that was more of a clarifying question in a way, except it felt more appropriate to include it here in the comment. Thank you very much for it's exciting to be part of the 8th review of this, or the 8th turnover of this. So thank you for all your hard work. It's an enormous undertaking.
Thank you, Sarah. Brady?
Yeah, I just want to mention and applaud the simplification of the plan. That's hard to do, and that's not the direction that large organizations and entities always go. Usually complexity is more of a downhill affair, and simplification actually is more of an uphill affair. So congratulations on that. And I also want to just say that Elizabeth Black wrote in a thank you note to us. That's also something that doesn't happen every day on something potentially controversial like this. And she explicitly mentioned all the things that she, the people that she's been working with sees reflected in the plan, and acknowledges that not everything she wanted was in there, but thank you for what was. And so I think both those things just speak to a really good process here. And so I want to echo what Sarah said too about Plan Boulder's comments. Some of it I would put in the category of a close edit and read, kind of copy edit, like the capitalization of open space. I mean, that kind of stuff seems like a great comment, and probably doesn't even require any deliberation. Some of them, this came in late, not like this afternoon. I didn't have time to look at it really. And so I guess I ask the board here, like, what do you all, do we want to look at this as a change to our motion, or is there another opportunity for these things to go into the plan? And do you guys have thoughts on how you want to handle this detailed input from Plan Boulder?
Sorry, John.
Oh, go
Are
ahead.
you asking for a reaction to
I
Plan
am
Boulder's
asking for the
comments?
board to deliberate and discuss this document that's in front of us and just see what our reaction is to it and what, if anything, we want to do with it at this stage. of
The reaction to Plan Boulder's comments?
Yeah.
I don't feel the need to deliberate on them. None of them are ones I would accept.
Oh, okay.
No, they lack flexibility that we're needing going forward.
Okay. So you view them as overly restrictive in general. I mean, like I said, I would put them in two categories. One is like a close copy edit, and like I said, the capitalization I think is helpful. And then there were some things about, being more explicit about development, about the value of well, you can read the
These are guiding principles, they're not prescriptions. And so I think that the comments would like the comp plan to be more prescriptive, and that's not the role of the comp plan. So for me, I don't feel the need to deliberate.
I'm wondering if KJ, in terms of like some of the more grammatical stuff, we also had a comment from Plan Boulder that pointed out that there is a parcel of land that actually is warranted to be under the open space designation, and it was missed. It may be, there's a closer look. If we continue to find things like that are just errors, they're not, do we need that to be encapsulated in a formal motion, or would staff still be able to deal with those type of issues that we might continue to see?
Yeah, absolutely. So any kind of errors or omissions, we can continue to make those changes up until June, like May 27th or something, whatever 1 week prior to our June 4th public hearing, we can continue to make those edits. We would, of course, defer to staff as far as capitalization of open space versus not capitalization. So we would work with you to confirm that. Yes, the one parcel down at the southern end of the boundary, it was misidentified as a land use designation as rural land. So we've already flagged that to get that updated and changed to open space. So those I don't believe need any kind of special motion language, but certainly if there are any specific edits or substantive changes that you would like planning board and council to consider, that should be incorporated into your motion. So if there's a clarification that you would like staff to add, that's something we could capture easily before May 18th. But if it's anything that's substantive or would change the intent of a statement, then what we would do is we would just package that as part of the recommendation from open space and carry that forward to planning board and council for them to consider.
Yeah, I didn't see any major changes there that I would like to include. It does sound like staff is going to make some changes, and the plan's not final anyway in terms of capitalization and double checking the map for property, to make sure everything's correct. I would be comfortable kind of leaving it to staff to make those minor changes. I'm not a big fan of nitpicking, the wording or the meaning of staff's recommendations live.
Right.
Are there substantive changes? I heard those as a review of the language and suggestions directed towards staff, not towards us in our what we're stating. But now I'm confused. Is there anything in there that I am not noticing that is substantive that we should be having a dialogue about as a board?
I think I can maybe help clarify that. Sounds like we have substantive changes along the lines of an updated parcel being coded as open space in the land use map, and potentially capitalization of open space where it's appropriate. I would say those two are changes that are necessary within the next version, before
And
it goes for approval.
I think those are more errors than substantive changes,
exactly.
right? Like
Okay.
that we're expecting you to correct.
Yeah. So what I would say is nice work. I've seen a lot of footprints that came from us and public comment in the changes in the last couple of touches that we've had. I imagine there are quite a few footprints, if I knew how to identify them, that came from open space staff. that helped out with comprehensive planning staff's work on these open space sections of the comp plan, and so commend them as well. I'd be comfortable with the sort of clerical corrections being made after we make our final sign off, if that's where we're headed tonight. I applaud people who do close readings. I think if I'm not sure I agree with Plan Boulder's rubric on capitalization, but it's worth thinking about. And if you agree with them, then I don't mind a change to be made along those lines, guys. Again, I don't think that's a really substantive change. That's not changing the substance of what these goals and policies for open space land are about in the comp plan. I didn't come prepared with anything substantive that I wanted to see changed, and I'm prepared to make a motion as well, and just leave it to staff with the understanding, if it's the understanding that's shared with other members of the board, that we're all good with making corrections of errors, corrections of rubric, if there's a better way of handling capitalization of the words open and space, for example, as a rubric change, and that's about it. Good luck with your series of meetings with Four Body Review coming up in June and July.
Thanks, Harmon. I'm comfortable with it as well, and comfortable, giving staff leeway to make corrections to any errors that have been identified and called out. So,
If I may, I find some of Plan Boulder's comments compelling, but like I said, I don't want to edit this real time as a board in front of everybody. And I think for me I would have liked to get them a little earlier so I could give it a full read and consider what a motion I would have proposed. But I guess, I don't know, I think some of these things, their wording changes. And I also think that some of this is coming from their perspective of trying to make sure that in the future, some of the original intent from an ecological side maintains. And I think I find that sentiment compelling. And I just want to say that being said, getting a 2 pages of edits, 3 p.m. before we're making a motion is a little maybe late in the game. But I'd be curious to see you all giving a close read to it. In one place they say something about, well, utilities operation could be more precisely worded. I mean, I just would encourage you all to give all these serious consideration. And I think, this particular entity's been a guardian of our open spaces for decades. And I think their observations and comments are worth giving careful consideration. That being said, I'm not proposing we change the motion right now.
okay.
Yeah, I agree with Brady's sentiments on that as well.
I do too. Thank you for articulating that.
Okay. Is anyone ready to make a motion?
Right here. Okay. So I'm going to make the motion. I move to recommend approval to Planning Board and City Council the following items related to open space and mountain parks managed lands for incorporation in the 2025 PVCP major update. OSBT supports 1. The updated future land use map and definitions of open space and greenways land use designations is provided in attachment A. 2. Revised open space related policies is provided in attachment B. 3. An updated graphic illustrating regional connections is provided in attachment C. And 4. Other open space related updates to the BVCP, including updated descriptions of open space and agriculture in the Boulder Valley, is provided in attachment D.
Thank you, Harmon, for taking over and reading the long motions. Used to be my job. Do we have a second?
You've got my job.
We traded places.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a motion and a second. Let's take a vote here. Harmon,
Yes.
Brady,
Yes.
Morgan,
Yes.
Sarah.
Sorry, yes.
Awesome. I will vote yes as well. So that's 5 votes yes on the motion.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, KJ.
Thank you
Thank
very
Thank you.
much.
Yes,
Thank
thanks
you.
everyone.
Appreciate it.
We'll move to matters from the department.
All right, I'll try to talk and clear the deck here and bring some other folks up. But our first item is something we do on an annual basis, and that is to highlight and provide an update on our 501c3 partner, the Boulder Open Space Conservancy. And with us tonight is Allison Duffy, the Executive Director for BOSC, as well as Janelle Freeston, who, along with Jeff Haley, are our staff liaisons for BOSC and go to board meetings and provide some guidance for Allison throughout the year. And so a great partnership. And so this is an opportunity for them to provide you all with their annual update.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And yeah, we're waiting for the PowerPoint. As we're waiting for the PowerPoint to come up, we're excited for this annual update. As we all know, BOSC, as a reminder, was founded in 2017, so almost 10 years ago. And they were started in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of the dedication of the 1967 open space tax. And so tonight, Allison will be with us to share some about the successes that BOSC has had over the last decade, almost decade, as well as plans for the rest of this year and into 2027, which includes some celebrating for the 60th anniversary of the open space past tax. And also that will be the 10-year anniversary for BOSC. So super excited there. And as Dan mentioned, Jeff and I have the pleasure to serve as ex officio members of BOSC as staff partners in this. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And as a reminder, as we know, with constrained budgets and increasing costs to do business for open space, now more than ever, it's been impressive and really supportive to have BOSC's help as a partner out in the community. And as we mentioned in the memo, BOSC is helping us to serve one of our master plan goals of financial sustainability, particularly FS1, which is helping to stabilize our funding and to be able to leverage community dollars and local dollars to help our work and our projects go even further. So super excited about that. In the memo, we also mentioned some of the projects that will be going, that BOSC has raised money towards in 2024 that we just received in March. So BOSC raised over $75,000 last year and just presented that to us just a couple months ago. And so that, and in the memo, we talk a little bit more about which projects that's going to go towards. So with the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Allie, who is again the executive director for BOSC, and we're really excited for you to be here. So thanks.
Thanks, Janelle, and thanks so much for having me tonight. It's great to be here again. Since last year when I was here, we've had some growth and success. Here's the current snapshot of Boulder Open Space Conservancy. We have 1 full-time executive director and 6 volunteer board members, 800 people on our email list, more than 1,500 followers on Instagram, and a growing list of supporters and donors. When I was first hired back in 2021, we had maybe 25 donors. We now have around 300 donors and growing on our mailing list. This tells me that people want to give back and support these lands, trails, and sensitive species even during tough times. Just a quick story, when I meet new people out on Pearl Street or out on trail or at a community event in Boulder, I talk about how Boulder OSMP trails have 6 million visits a year, and that is 2 million more than our neighbors at Rocky Mountain and Yellowstone National Parks have. They always gasp, no matter what. Not only that, but we have millions less acres than our national parks neighbors and hundreds miles less trails. So 2 million more visits in a significantly less concentrated amount of space. And just like our national parks neighbors have very established and impactful 100-year-old nonprofit friend groups that support public education programs, enhance visitor experiences, and fundraise for restoration projects in the parks, we have BOSC, who has really just started in the last couple of years. And since reporting here a year ago, I have heard or incorporated OSBT feedback, and I'm happy to hear from you this year, OSBT. And Sarah Glynn is on the BOSC board, and I've been meeting with Brady about expanding our fundraising program. Next slide, please. In the slides ahead, I will talk about how many various and important projects our community and visitors may choose to support. So many projects that we have organized them within these 3 program pillars: climate and ecosystem health and resilience, connecting youth with nature, responsible recreation and infrastructure. This is a screenshot from our website, www.bosc.org, and more detailed project information can be found at the OSMP webpage. That's brand new. This just from a couple months ago. Next slide, please. Here we show a chart of contributions BOSC has given to OSMP, and I would just like to briefly explain this chart. You'll see that it starts at 2017. As Janelle mentioned earlier, BOSC was founded in 2017 at the 50th anniversary celebration of the passage of the open space sales tax. For the first few years of BOSC, the all-volunteer BOSC board was focusing on a project that, after some time working on it, the project changed direction. So very little funds were raised by the BOSC board during the first couple years, therefore no funds were given to OSMP. Then COVID hit and they went into hibernation. In spring 2021, the board decided to hire a part-time contractor development director, me. My first project for which to raise funds was Mount Sanitas. In early 2022, we gave OSMP a check for $35,905 from funds raised in 2021. Skipping ahead from funds raised last year, Janelle just mentioned this, at our last board meeting in March, we gave OSMP a check for $75,000 to support various projects. So far, we have given almost $300,000 to support OSMP projects, most of which has been raised in the last 5 years. Yes. Oh, that's okay. This is great. Thank you. So my goal this year is to raise $100,000 for OSMP projects, and I will do this by implementing a large-scale Step Up for Sanitas community awareness and fundraising campaign that I will talk more about in a minute, continuing to raise funds through the Maddie Lignell Legacy Fund to support the Boulder Junior Rangers, offering private flight seeing tours with OSMP expert guides, offering community cultivation events, forming a BOSC anniversary committee to plan for campaigns and events next year, partnering with Sundance Film Festival, and continuing to partner with Boulder International Film Festival. Next slide, please. So we are in the midst of implementing right now a larger scale for us community awareness and fundraising campaign that includes a 9x5 postcard that I forgot to bring tonight that was directly mailed to approximately 5,000 households in the last week of April that are in the 80304 and 80302 neighborhoods around Sanitas. We designed this matching poster that I believe is up on trails around Sanitas. Yes. And I'm working to distribute those posters to local retailers. They're in my car. And we also have these flyers that I'll give to you after I'm done here. And OSMP volunteers are going to be handing out on trails. And we're also partnering, if you've heard of the Mad Hatter on Sanitas, who gives away hats. He is very excited to be giving away these flyers to people who he talks to. He's got a whole email list. He's got a whole community growing. And I'm excited for that collaboration with the Sanitas Mad Hatter. So far, since the postcard was mailed, folks have donated over $15,000. My goal is to raise $25,000 by June 15th. I had a meeting yesterday with the Mad Hatter, and he really thinks that we're going to blow that goal out of the water. So that's exciting. Next slide, please. We are honored to host the Maddie Lignell Legacy Fund in partnership with the Ash Lignell family. Maddie's Legacy Fund was established in 2021 following the tragic and untimely death of Madison Ash Lignell. Maddie was the quintessential Boulder kid, and he was a junior ranger for 4 years. Being a junior ranger helped shape who he was: generous, adventurous, curious, conscientious, and compassionate. This photo is from Maddie's Legacy Fund annual day of remembrance and service that includes junior ranger staff, alumni, families, friends, and community members of various ages and backgrounds. From compassionate supporters' gifts of donation to Maddie's Legacy Fund and from grant funds over the past 4 years, together we have raised approximately $20,000 to support the Boulder Junior Rangers. These funds have been used for bus passes, snacks, equipment, outdoor gear, plus leadership and emotional health workshops for the Boulder Junior Rangers. Next slide, please. In partnership with Lighthawk, a nonprofit that pairs conservation organizations with pilots and their aircrafts, our Boulder Flight Seeing Tour, coined by Sarah, is a special opportunity for our major donors to see from above the past, present, and future of this community's dedicated conservation efforts. While in flight at about 7,500 feet, passengers will learn from an OSMP expert. Oh, it might be Dan.
Getting my
Wings.
yeah, I'm getting my courage. It's a small plane.
Yes, it's a very small plane. The geologic population and climate change effects, as we see Boulder's iconic rock formations and agriculture lands and habitat conservation areas from an eagle-eye view, burn scars, and landscape alterations left from floods and wildfire. As population and visitor use increases, so does the pressure on resources and maintenance needs, as we know. So we will discuss our role in supporting these projects and how the passengers can engage and support. These are a few of my photos from when we did a test flight last month. It was very exciting. It was quite an experience. And we are finalizing the script and our program to offer one flight seeing tour per quarter. Next slide, please. Full Moon Jazz. We invite our community to come out, relax, bring a picnic, listen to a soothing jazz trio as the full moon rises in the east and the sun sets in the west. This unique event, usually in September each year, is getting more popular. So we added a second date coming up Sunday, May 31st. I would love for you all to come. Spots are filling up fast though, so please RSVP to me, Allison, ALYSON, at bosc.org, and I will send you the venue and event details. Next slide, please. BOSC has been a BIF, Boulder International Film Festival, call to action partner and film sponsor for the last 5 years. With our connections to local conservationists and researchers, we help put together an engaging panel discussion with the audience immediately after the film. We hope to partner with Sundance to bring awareness of Boulder's conservation program and BOSC to their audience. We had a meeting in February with Sundance to begin partnership discussions, which is very exciting. They seem eager to partner with us. Next slide, please. And this is the back of the Step Up for Sanitas flyer that OSMP volunteers will be giving out. And it has a QR code if you are moved to make a contribution. And I also have a few here for you to take and pass on. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for your support and partnership, OSBT, OSMP, City of Boulder. It's an honor and a privilege to work with you and our community for the protection of this incredible place. And then I think I have a slide of some questions. Do you have any questions about the mission of BOSC and our current focus with the program pillars? Does OSBT have additional ways that you would like to be involved with BOSC? Or do you see any further opportunities that BOSC should pursue? Maybe bungee jumping off the second Flatiron?
Yeah.
Just because we have the flights. Just kidding. I was just kidding.
Are y'all going to continue to partner with Taco Fest?
We are. Yes, we are a benefiting charity of Taco Fest, and for every volunteer that we that signs up on our behalf, we get a donation from the event organizers.
Yeah, so it's awesome. I love seeing y'all associated with that. It's my happy place, Boulder Taco Fest. If y'all haven't been, it is amazing. It is amazing. It's a very special place, especially if you love tacos.
That's great. It's here downtown too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
it's right
is.
over here. August 23rd, I think it is.
Does anyone have any thoughts, questions?
The donation chart with the like hockey stick line, that's pretty good. So congratulations on that. That's hard. And
Yeah.
to do over time. And I have a question for maybe staff or maybe you, Allie, is if someone came to you and said, I want to, let's just say hypothetically, I want to pay for some wildfire mitigation in a certain place, or to what extent can you accept restricted gifts, which may even be slightly prescriptive, saying like, hey, I want this to happen on open space. I've got a bunch of money and I suspect it's something you want to do anyway, but I want to pay for this part of it. What is that something people can do?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would have a conversation with Jeff and Janelle about that particular project, and we can designate those funds to go to that project.
Mm-hmm.
I can say a few more things. When we are developing the CIP process in the fall, so we will then look for candidates for projects that either we could use additional money to leverage, or if there's some projects that we have to say no to entirely, then we will share those with BOSC and say, hey, as long as they fit in those 3 pillars, then actually in our website, we have more details. So we do have a climate related project right now. And last year, some of the money went towards the improvements on Flagstaff to the infrastructure to close Panorama Point. So each year when donors give money, yes, sometimes people might come with an idea, but it does have to be vetted through staff first. Other times they can just give money to whatever the highest need is. And so then BOSC will give us some money that's non-discretionary. And then as staff, we'll have a conversation. What are the highest needs? Is there anything that has come up more short-term, like last year at this time? And we're like, let's put that towards Flagstaff.
And do you come up with a little bit of a menu in that regard?
Of projects?
Or just kind of buckets like that
Yes.
people, yeah. Okay.
The program pillars, connecting youth with nature, which we have other projects that are in need of funding that are not necessarily youth and nature, like the terrain hopper for trail accessibility, and climate and ecosystem health and resilience, and responsible recreation and infrastructure are the pillars
Right.
that all the projects fall under. And then there can be just general, which we do also cut them a check for just general funds.
Right. What doesn't fit in those 3 pillars? Is there something specifically that doesn't fit in the 3 pillars?
Trying to think
for
folks who have
kind of all
offered
inclusive
projects. Yeah, we try to mirror it with the master plan, quite honestly, to kind of, we try to mirror the pillars to align with the master plan focus areas. So yeah, so far we haven't really gotten folks offering something that we can't. Yeah.
I would say that what we're really looking for, is it a project that is already something that is in the works or that we're desiring to do? Like for somebody to ask, say, I'll give you 10,000 if you do that, and it's something that we either weren't going to do or we decided we didn't, just because we got the money wouldn't mean that we would say yes. So we're trying to align it with stuff that's already in the hoppers, and perhaps some additional monies will allow us to do more on that project that we could have done based on our base funding, or it could, like Janelle was saying, is, boy, we would have liked to have done that. We just didn't have the money this year, but now we would. So I think the alignment with the staff's plans is sort of the key.
Yeah. I guess my only comment now, I'll just let it go, is the 3 pillars are great, but maybe being a little bit more explicit within that. And I mean, I don't have to tell you what the community is really passionate about right now. The community is really passionate about some things right now. And that's probably an opportunity to raise money if it can fit with what your all's priorities are, and also you can paint a picture for the donor, that, okay, how are we going to have a better outcome than we would have with just straight tax dollars? Because I think that's what most donors are going to want to know. What's the additional benefit that I will see and the community will see? And it's not just some fungible activity where my money's going to go here and then the tax dollars that would have paid for that are going to go somewhere else. And I think if that storytelling becomes part of your growth and matching those community passions with the need and the story of how our open space system can be better and different with their support, I think you'll see that line of growth continue. So that's my only comment.
Great, thank you.
Morgan?
Allie, we're so lucky just for your time and commitment, and I hear you. You're the ED, and it just what a privilege that. And so my question is, I have a couple. BOSC essentially acts like a friends group to the department. Is that right? Yeah. And have you all done like $75,000 is a lot of money. It doesn't go that far when you're splitting it out among 6 projects, but it seems relatively low to the potential for philanthropic investment in open space in Boulder, and knowing what our community that our community invests heavily in community projects. Have you all done like a landscape assessment or any just kind of fielding the opportunities within the city of Boulder and philanthropic foundations? And my point is, I think the opportunity is hundreds of times $75,000, knowing what our community looks like.
Right.
And
No,
knowing the number of events that you all are running, 75 seems low. And it's not an indictment of the effort, because the commitment and investment is there, but I think there's a lot of potential. So how have you explored that?
absolutely. I have mostly focused on building our individual donors. I have written a couple of grants, and there's definitely more potential to be explored. And if you have ideas, I would love to meet with you about them and come up with a plan. That would be really helpful, actually.
Yeah, I just see your wisdom and just time and energy and commitment, and matching that with again, knowing what our community looks like and their daily use of open space and
Right.
passion for it. That combined, I think, can leverage a lot more money for the department.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be great.
So thank you for everything you've done to date. And Janelle seems thrilled by the partnership, and Jeff too. And I know it adds a lot of value and just community support outside of just the dollars you raise too. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Morgan.
Yeah, so Allison, just want to commend you for all the fine service and help to the department as a, like Morgan said, a friends group to the OSMP. Also, sort of piggybacking on Brady's comments about having an influence on priorities within the 3 pillars. It's not just a good thing for BOSC, but I think it's also a good thing for the community, because it's another forum where members of the community can get involved directly in the work that the department does. We try to provide the forum for that here at OSBT meetings, and you do the same thing in a different way with money attached to it. So thank you very much, and that's about it.
Right, thank you.
Sarah, anything you want to add?
Sure. I actually sit on the board of BOSC. More recently, I joined the board there, and so I am a bit of a liaison between the 2 boards, I guess, in a sense, though formally I'm just a board member of BOSC. And I think the comments that I've heard from the trustees are very much reflect, I think, Allison, things you've heard me say as I've joined. So I think you guys are really spot on. And I'm going to actually now appreciate my fellow trustees for your quick assessment and your feedback there. Now I'm going to, this is great because I get to speak about this as a trustee instead of, I'm going to put on my trustee hat. I do feel that we as a department could do a better job. We could do more as a department to help provide BOSC with more specific asks in terms of dollars needed for specific projects. and then I'll put on my boss hat, and I know internally that Allison, we only have one executive director, and she's responsible for running the board, and helping to recruit new board members, along with administering the organization, getting everything together for these full moon jazz events, and then also trying to build out individual donor bases, corporate donor bases, and so you kind of get the picture. So I know that Ali's working. She's just she's very methodical and thoughtful, and putting in her full effort with the time that we have for her. And so I do think we are having a little bit of growing pains, and I do see a future where we're going to be able to build the board. It will take some additional time and have a more functioning board that's out there doing some of that fundraising. But I do think from within the department, I would really like to see, as a trustee, I would like to see continued efforts for the department to get very specific about what the gaps are from a budgetary standpoint, so that we can plan ahead into 2027 and 2028 to where we could get very specific. We could specifically support you. Fire resilience being a great example. We know we have community will. We could probably get some decent sized checks, but what are we doing with those checks? That's information we actually need from internal staff. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I do think there's a ton of opportunity for us to expand BOSC and its presence in the community. And at the same time, by the same token, I do see how the expansion is growing. It's growing methodically and carefully, and that is happening under Ali's leadership. So thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Sarah.
Couldn't help myself. One more comment. We've been, comparing ourselves to Rocky Mountain National Park a bit, and I think their annual budget is like 17, 18 million. Is that correct? Somewhere in that vicinity.
It's pretty high.
Kind of to your point, and it's not analogous because it's more of an internationally known or nationally known destination. But in 2024, the Rocky Mountain Conservancy's revenues were 8.6 million, which is like on the close to 50% of the park's budget. And so it's suffice to say that park wouldn't work. It wouldn't look the way it looks right now without Rocky Mountain Conservancy. And so if we, now again, I don't think that necessarily tells us exactly what the capacity of this community is to support BOSC and our open space system, but it gives us an idea that there's a gap between where we are and where we could be. And I think what I would say is big ideas attract big dollars, and people don't give to need, they give for possibility. And so I would just encourage, echo what some of the trustees have said, work with the staff and come up with some big, bold ideas and ones that are going to resonate with what this community is passionate about. And I think you could see a step change, not just a hockey stick continued growth, but a step change in your revenues. I think that's certainly a possibility. That being said, what you have been doing, I know, is really hard and has been effective as well. But I think you're poised for a step change and maybe have some transformational gifts come through BOSC. And that when that happens, it's going to be really exciting, and you'll feel that the wind is at your back. So
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks, board, for all the great comments. Appreciate that. All right. Just want to check in with the chair before we go to our last main item. Is anybody compelled for a few-minute break, or are we just ready to keep rolling? All right, we're going to keep going. Our last main item from Matters to the Department is actually sort of, it wasn't a specific ask of the board, but when we were bringing our, it started actually last year, in which we were starting to bring forward at the retreat in particular about focusing in on one of our financial sustainability master plan strategies, which talks about diversifying and our revenue, and then one specifically about looking at our portfolio of assets. And one area that's been a big focus for ours is our residential portfolio, and wanting to analyze exactly what's under the hood there from how we use those residences, what are the costs of those residences. And when we brought one specific strategy potential for you in regards to the Hodges property, I think we realized there was a gap of and a hunger for more information from this board before we would look at a very specific strategy. So we're taking a step back from that. So anyone who's listening that's sort of following the Hodges, there's no specific proposal now in front of this board at this time for the Hodges residence in of itself. Instead, we took the feedback we were getting from the community, feedback we were hearing from the board, and reassessing the information that we should bring forward to you. And we want to begin that sort of that reassessment, if you will, by looking at our residential portfolio in more detail and really honing in on the costs and the uses of those properties, and also start to dabble a little bit more into the protection tools for properties, although I think a lot of that would be saved for potential future discussion about the pros and cons of conservation easements versus fee, and exactly what are the terms of conservation easements that we could look at, how do they work, and that could be a future conversation if that's the will of this board. But tonight is more about the residential properties and a little bit about the real estate strategies that go along with it. So I'm supported by two of my colleagues, Lauren Kilcoyne and Jeff Haley, who are going to take various aspects of what I just said and dive a little bit deeper and hopefully have a good conversation with you all tonight.
So I'm to Dan's point, you've heard about the real estate components of this several times. We've had previous touches on the residential use analysis. And we had an opportunity at our board retreat last fall to very briefly talk about the real estate program. So I just really want to make sure I'm providing very high level information, and then making sure Jeff has the time to go through all of the great content that Dan just laid out. Very high level, want to just talk about where we've been. So several years ago, a number of years ago, the real estate team led a cross-functional effort within open space and mountain parks to complete this residential analysis. So that project included our real estate staff, agriculture staff, cultural historic facilities, and we had a lot that we were asking that team to look at. And there are many factors here that we were considering when we talked about our residences. So condition and cost, of course, what our asset management approach would be, whether there was a programmatic use for the residents, what the open space values of the property, historic status, et cetera. And we were really looking for data that would support our ability to manage that portfolio of residences in the long run. Most of our residences are actively used in support of programmatic purposes, predominantly agriculture, which Jeff will talk about in a little bit. But there were a few that were not in active programmatic use, which is where some of this conversation came from. So we worked really hard at identifying whether there could be a programmatic use, or would there be some other way to preserve the land that weren't using the residents specifically in programmatic use. So we were looking at all of the tools that we had available. There's been a lot that's shifted in the macro and regional environment since that assessment, right? The way that we're thinking about farming, the national climate, and the way that some of those lands are being stewarded. And so we're always assessing how best should we move forward. Are we in touch with what the community is looking for? Do we have the best data available to inform our decisions on these things, et cetera? So it's been several years now, and we want to make sure that we're continuing to update you on the real estate components, as well as how those things how these residences are being used. And for the next slide, part of what inspired this project, just for those who might not be aware, I think probably most or all of you are, we want to make sure, first and foremost, that we're doing what we said we would do. We're delivering on our commitments to the community. And this project came out of our master planning process. So when we were going through a very robust master planning process, setting a 10-year vision, we established a financial sustainability focus area. And we knew that we wanted to continue, of course, to protect all of our lands, but we also knew that some things had changed. We would have fiscal constraints going into the next 10 years. We had a number of other open space agencies that had been developed around us that could be partners in stewarding land in a way that wasn't true when some of these lands were first acquired. And then we also knew that we had a shifting climate with some of our partnerships where we had entities that were interested in helping us to protect and steward land. So previous open space plans around acquisition, specifically the 2013 to 2019 acquisition plan, really rolled into this master plan. And you can see some examples on this slide, which is small text, and I won't read it to you, but we tried to outline what our 10-year priorities would be for the real estate program within the financial sustainability focus area. So we specifically called out that we wanted to partner to protect land, and that we should evaluate our existing real estate assets to understand if another entity could help us steward the land, or in this case, the residents. So if we shift to the next slide, this is a very long history. We're very grateful for the public engagement on our real estate program, and this has been true for decades and decades. And these are a couple of examples before we set our master plan into effect in 2019. Real estate and what our plans were for acquisition and preservation of land showed up in so many of our plans over time. And we were at those times calling out where we wanted to preserve and protect land, how we would build this system. And you already know this, but many times when we went to actually do those things that we had talked about with the public, a lot of that property came with a house on it. And so we grew this residential portfolio over time. Shift. So I'm not going to talk a lot about real estate tools. I have a couple slides where we can talk about some of the real estate tools that are available to us, but I just want to call this one out. Acquisition is one of many of our real estate tools. It's the one that we're most familiar with. So what you see in this graphic here is oftentimes we were acquiring land, but then we were often enough acquiring real estate, so land that had a structure on it. And then we've had opportunities over time to look at what we call it the bundle of sticks, or the bundle of rights would come with that land, and how we want to use some of those rights in the acquisition and management of land over time. Some of the other tools that we have available to us are just things that we talk about less often, but also have a lot of great potential in helping us to preserve and steward land. I won't go through each of these. There's more detail in your packet, but when we started to talk about the residences here and a pilot disposal, we had always intended that some of these tools would be available to help us steward that land, even if we were not the fee owner of that property. So if we were in the future to pursue a disposal, we would have options around conservation easements, scenic easements, building and language that would make sure that some of those open space values were protected in the event of a disposal. How those things are similar and different, we are very happy to dive into at some sort of future agenda item or business meeting if you'd like to. But whatever tool we would have chosen, and of course we're zooming out now and reassessing, and I think that's really important and wonderful, but whatever tool we would have chosen would have allowed us as the landowner, as the folks selling the land, to impose restrictions or obligations to prevent or control development. So I think some of what we heard in the community feedback was really around what development might look like if we weren't the owner, or some sort of loss of open space value if we weren't the owner. And there's a lot of room for how this might look if we ever did pursue a disposal, but I just wanted to take an opportunity to say that in many of these real estate tools, we would have the opportunity to continue to protect land without fee ownership. And just for awareness, if that is something that we were to pursue in the future, there are many, many things that we think about when we build one of these transactions, if we were on board a new conservation easement or anything like that. And I think in the interest of responding to public concern, want to say that anytime we were to pursue something like this, we would absolutely be considering our conservation objectives, restrictive covenants. We would make sure we're doing due diligence and considering all of the charter purposes on a piece of property that we would want to protect in the future. And so with that, I'll be transitioning it over to Jeff, but I would leave you with what we're thinking about now from a real estate perspective is considering our broader portfolio, the entire system of land, and how we should maintain the land and all of the residences in the most effective way. We want to make sure we're using the best preservation mechanism that's available to us. And we know, especially in a fiscally constrained budget, that there are costs to maintaining all of these properties, and Jeff will talk about that in more depth. And we're thinking about the trade-offs, the day-to-day maintenance, and how we can simultaneously deliver on our commitment to steward all the open space lands into the future. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thanks, Lauren. Jeff Haley, Deputy Director for Visitor Experience and Infrastructure. And as Lauren mentioned, and Dan as well, we'd like to kind of dive a little deeper into specifically our residential structures and facilities. Last year, you might remember Ben Mayer presented to the board, Morgan, obviously you weren't here, about our overall facilities program area and staffing and budget and that sort of thing. Ben actually has since retired, lucky for him, and We have a new staff member, Josh Maeda Jones, who's actually online with us this evening, and he may chime in on some if questions if needed. But he's our acting facilities senior manager, so he's been really supportive, and just want to thank him for a lot of the help in kind of carrying the torch and bringing us forward with our facilities management. We have over, approximately 363 structures across OSMP in terms of our land area as we know it. Of those, we have 37 residential structures. And so what this slide's kind of going through is what are those structures? What are we mandated to do? What is our focus? So 27 of them are actually leased through a third party property management company to tenants, leased just like you would imagine with any kind of rental agreement. And then 10 of those structures that make up the 37 are actually set aside for staff or operational use. I'll talk more in a moment specifically what that means, but that really comprises that residential portfolio. As Lauren was mentioning, we've been through many years of really wonderful acquisition, growing the land system, preserving, conserving, and now we have some structures and facilities that come along with that. And that's what we're maintaining and making sure those serve a charter purpose. And that's really our core philosophy, transitioning more into preservation, taking care of them, doing proactive maintenance, make sure we keep the condition in good working order so that they can serve a charter purpose on OSMP. This is just a quick kind of map representation of where all those residential structures exist. The chart on the right, which is, very small text, basically outlines the 37 properties or structures. And you can see, basically all along the north, the east, and the south portions of our land system, not very many on the western mountain backdrop, obviously, but definitely north and kind of the Joder North Trail Study area, we have some residences up there. So it really encompasses all of our kind of regions. In terms of our asset management or taking care of these structures, as I mentioned, in 2016 we did a comprehensive asset management inspection and kind of assessment of all the all the structures. Back then, the backlog was estimated at $4 million. And really what that assessment did is it went in depth into every structure, every home, every building, and looked at, what are the deficiencies, what are the issues. You can imagine kind of like a home inspection, HVAC, building systems, roof, foundation materials and that sort of thing. And then also, what are those functional goals? How is it being used? What could it be used? That sort of thing. So we're continuing to maintain, continuing to take care of them. Again, at that point, it was $4 million backlog. You'll see in a moment that has increased a bit. But current conditions vary across the structures. We have 16 that are in good condition. I'll talk more about that in a moment. 16 are in fair. And then we actually have 5, unfortunately, that are in poor enough condition that they're not inhabited. How we take care of them, again, we do a combination, like I said, with our in-house crews, our in-house staff, working closely with contractors, actual FTE and that sort of thing, as well as our third-party property manager, who's managing and overseeing several of those 27 of the residential structures. The third-party management, as you can imagine, rent collection, working with the tenants, lease, relations, maintenance, repairs, site visits. But I just want to emphasize it's not hands-off. We're not just kind of letting them do their thing. We do quarterly inspections. The staff actually go out. We look at the maintenance logs. What's the funding being spent on? What's being done in the properties? So there's a lot of oversight, a lot of coordination in that regard for those leased properties. And so in terms of budget, what does this mean? We really wanted to provide a little bit of an oversight of our residential portfolio and what does that mean financially. Our current replacement value for all these structures, the 37 specifically, is about $16 million. What that means is if, similar to your own homes, what that value of the structure is if you went and just assess that currently. Industry standards, we basically kind of abide by a lot of asset management standards, building industry standards. So typically you want to invest about 2% of that current replacement value, which in our case is about $320,000 a year. Now, what that means is just kind of routine preventative maintenance. And if a building or facility is in good condition, that's great. We set aside that money, we take care of it, keeps it in good condition. As we rent and lease those structures, you can see we actually get about $340,000 per year in rental revenue. And that's kind of an average across multiple years that we, lease rates go up and down and that sort of thing. And then we also have capital funding that we assign or identify. We've had a lot of budget discussions over the past year or so. Our CIP, or capital improvement budget specifically, we allocate, there's a couple key projects related to facility assessment repairs, rehabilitating historic structures, that sort of thing. Most recently, you're familiar, in fact, the photo here, you'll recognize the Wells property, the Wells house on the Fort Chambers Poor Farm. So that's a prime example of how we have to budget. This structure, as you can see, has fallen in pretty bad condition, disrepair. It's not currently occupied and needs a major renovation. So that's going to be upwards of 800 to close to $1 million just for that one. So those are the challenges we're seeing. Our third-party property manager, we see basically every year they're putting in about $220,000 annually in maintenance on those 27 structures. In other words, we collect rent, and then a lot of times they go back, turn around and kind of invest that. They do maintenance and repairs as needed. So again, good condition, it means, just as been renovated or rehabilitated. We probably have a tenant living in there. We're in this routine maintenance. The fair condition means that people are likely occupying, living there. But as you all might have with your own home, a roof needs to be replaced. Some other major backlog exists that you're saving up for or trying to plan into your budget. Whereas the poor condition, 5 of those structures, like I said, substantial repair and replacement is needed, just like wells. So the current backlog is what we're estimating at about $9 million. It's grown obviously since 2016, and that's kind of the current state. Now, how are these residences used? Dan kind of alluded to that in the intro remarks, but we have a variety of uses. Again, we kind of look at those charter purposes. Agriculture is a big one, as you can imagine. A lot of our agricultural lands are working landscapes. There's barns, there's loafing sheds, and a lot of time homes and houses. And we certainly enjoy the opportunity to support local agricultural workers, food production. So 62% of that 37 falls into that agricultural kind of piece of the pie. 19% is leased. And again, that 19%, sometimes those are ag workers as well, where folks that, we have a home that might be available that they can lease and use. 11% that we identify as our staff operational use. I'll mention more about that in a moment. And then some of them are just historic or unoccupied. Again, Wells is a good example. There's a couple others. The Veely House, for example, South Boulder Road, Cherryvale, if you're familiar with that kind of open area just east of town. There's a large home right there on the southwest corner of that intersection. That's called the Veely House. It's owned and managed by us, and it's also in pretty poor condition and scheduled for improvements in the future. So back to the agricultural workforce. Again, one of our goals of the portfolio is to support agriculture. I won't deep dive into that. In fact, I think, agriculture has been a big topic for the board and a lot of agenda items, but the residential portfolio definitely supports that program area. Barns, homes, sheds, and that sort of thing. We have, like I said, about 62% of those homes are available for ag tenants or are actually on a agricultural site. Boulder Valley Farm, as example, Shanahan, Cherryvale, some of those properties you can imagine, all the homes. And then we have about 30 tenants actually that are associated with agricultural operations and workers in those programs that we're supporting through the housing. So that's a big use. When I mentioned a minute ago about our staff operations use, specifically our trails program and our vegetation stewardship, each of those kind of program areas use homes as well. Trails, one of the great things is we can actually use some of our homes to allow trail crews, contracted crews to spend the night or lodge in those houses on a short-term basis. And then our veg stewardship, for example, you can see some of these images. We actually have operations kind of working out of those homes and adjacent kind of nursery or grow operations for some of our plant material and seed and that sort of thing for veg stewardship programs across the system. So key takeaways, again, just in summary, we have a large and complex portfolio of residential structures. As I mentioned, it takes a lot to take care of those. We want to be proactive in doing that. We don't necessarily have all the funding and money to do that, just like many of our program areas, just like we talked about with Allison and Boulder Open Space Conservancy. These are areas that we have to kind of plan in, schedule repairs. We do have a backlog of maintenance that we're trying to take care of and chip away at. But they do provide a diverse revenue source. So when we lease those out, we do get some funding back to help offset those costs to maintain those. And they do provide a good benefit of providing agricultural work, supporting our agricultural uses and staff operations. So, you know, we're just as Lauren mentioned with the acquisition and kind of fiscally constrained budget, we're always looking at cost saving opportunities, looking at residential structures. Are they mission critical? Do we have ways that we could, you know, review that portfolio, use the taxpayer dollars wisely, the open space fund wisely, and that sort of thing. So I think that wraps it up for us. Certainly Lauren, Dan, and I answer any questions, or if we need to dive into any deep information on any of the properties, that sort of thing. But thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Harmon?
So the revenue that comes off of the rented properties, some of it you alluded to it going back, pumping back some of that revenue into the properties, but not all of it. So where does the other 120,000 or so, by my count, go?
Do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start and others feel free to chime in.
Yeah.
So there's a percentage off of, so to Jeff's point, we have a third party that helps us manage the residential leases. And so they maintain reserves that we agree upon in our arrangement with them, where they're investing a certain amount of that money directly back into the property itself. The difference in that revenue comes back to the fund, to the open space fund. And every year in our CIP, you see our facilities maintenance capital improvement program project. And that is where we're looking at all of the preventative routine deferred maintenance on some of these structures and others across the open space system. So when we went through our baseline condition assessment, we actually scheduled out for, 15, 20 years in each year, which building is going to need which replacement of which component in that structure. So the balance would be reinvested into our facility CIP and then allocated based on the priority needs of structures on the system. Okay. I'll say that the majority of that money over the last 10 years has gone into agricultural structures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question I'd like to pose is, just from a sort of a staffing perspective, would it be maybe like an incentive to create a position where, you know, you sort of run these residential properties like an enterprise fund? I'm not suggesting that we raise the rents to the point where they become really profitable for OSMP, but to, you know, balance the need for housing and affordable housing for our tenant farmers and so forth. And for staff and for the needs of staff with, you know, the sort of the use of the property to fund its own renewal. If all the money that gets thrown off from rent and maybe with a few a little extra money kicked in from CIP to give it a head start, that with full occupancy and not having tenant occupiable structures, the whole residential program could be an enterprise fund and run itself. I don't know, just throwing that out there.
Yeah, that's definitely something to consider. You know, we have to balance and weigh like what is the overhead and the administrative cost and how many positions would that warrant or require. You know, the beauty of the third party, you know, they're dealing with the legal, the leases, the paying rent collection, all those kind of things. Just the main reason anybody uses property managers. But yeah, I mean, if we looked at it more of a enterprise revenue production and kind of pointing that money back into having kind of a self-sustaining business model, that's something we could explore.
Yeah, and as we have been in our budget development process, we're looking at revenue generation. Are we adequately projecting out our revenues in some of these categories, including but additional to our sales and use taxes? And so this is a place where we have a line item on our revenue side of our fund financial to talk about these leases and the value that they bring in. One of the things we think about, and we heard through the master plan, the agricultural plan, is the importance of using these for agriculture. And so part of the way we set those rents is with the tenants in mind and what their income situation is. And that's one of the things that I think shifted when we started talking about Hodges. What we were hearing at the time of the master plan is it is critical for the house to be on the land it serves. And I think what we started to hear when folks were tuning into the Hodges conversation is it's so expensive to live here that I don't need to live on the land I'm working. If there's a place where I could live affordably as a farm worker, that would still have value to me, even if I had to drive 10 minutes instead of, instead of being in the city. So, I think we're just balancing those uses. And is there an opportunity for revenue generation? And how do we weigh that with wanting farmers to have a lower base rent?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I've got maybe it's the same question, but are we break even on these when you take a look at what we're leasing with any kind of reasonable overhead allocation? Are we close? What do the financials look like if you do a little?
Well, I mean, I would say in terms of break even, what I was talking about the backlog. I mean, when we look at all the structures, we need more funding to really bring all the conditions up of our current portfolio to a good condition where we can then manage at more of a routine preventative maintenance.
Right.
So
let's just say the ones that are occupied though,
Mm.
like the ones that are actually we can rent now. Take the kind of lost cause or not lost cause, but expensive ones off the table. The ones that we're actually leasing right now, what is the break even analysis back of the envelope?
Yeah, we get maybe a quarterly or so report from the property manager on what they're investing in, some of the routine upkeep. We're probably not that far off on the ones that are in a routine. I wouldn't say we're breaking even. I would say we're probably not that far off on the ones that we've already done the major capital investment on. And then it's those ones that are, to Jeff's point, that are still in deferred that on the whole, if you looked at that program, would put us in a place of not recovering costs.
Yeah. And they, like the leased ones, I think I showed on that slide, about 320,000 revenue generation, I believe, is what we had. And then then they invest back in about 220, but that's just kind of the preventative routine. We had to go in and do this, that, and the other. It's not the big, like Lauren's mentioned, that assessment years ago said, hey, you got HVAC, you got a roof, you got a basement's flood, water intrusion, whatever the case is. So those are the big things that we have to budget for in our capital. And so we're not quite there yet. So in other words, we're not breaking even in the sense of like, yep, they're all in good condition and the rental fees and everything else keep them, and we're just making equity money or whatever that, so it's not quite that break even. But it's supporting itself pretty well, and taking some of the load off of the staff for sure.
Yeah, I think the other consideration when we look at the use of and one of our goals is to try to get as many of these into supporting our agriculture. And those leases are offered below market rate because that's the situation with agricultural housing and the needs. And so to manage it as a moneymaker, probably we'll never be able to approach that because this other big goal in mind, which is viable agriculture and the need for housing, is going to always place those well below market value. So we sort of have that other goal in mind, which then does reduce the amount of revenue that we could generate from
But to Lauren's point, we could house people somewhere else. It doesn't. We don't have to solve the problem with these residences necessarily.
Yeah, that's been the complexity. And we've had periodic conversations with HHS about their affordable housing portfolio. And I think what we've been able to do is use most of our residences for agriculture and then use sort of a sliding scale assessment based on the revenue generation and income on those farms to set a rate. But I agree with Dan that right now they are below market rate.
All right, well, just comment and maybe
Yeah.
a little bit of a question is, I hope that looking at ways to advance our mission, other than holding absolutely everything in fee, is still on the table. I don't know if it is. We put something out there. We got some strong community feedback. We took it back off the table, is what I'm hearing. And so I would encourage you to not give up. We're always going to be fiscally constrained, and there's way bigger pressures potentially, with the public realm consolidation and other things. This community will always be upset about any change in open space. And I'm not saying the Hodges concerns weren't justified, but I encourage you to keep looking at creative things to take big liabilities off of our books. We can't just do it through increasing taxes, and we have to be able to take management decisions on both the top line and the bottom line. And I think this community needs to understand that. Maybe Hodges wasn't the right place to start. So I would encourage you to keep thinking about that. And let's do a site visit next time. Let's go slow. And let's get everybody there and the community there, and let's look at the condition of the siding. You know what I mean? And just really think about this and talk about it, so that when we come back, potentially, we've looked at it every which way and we're ready as a board and as a staff to potentially take some heat on a decision like that. Anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah.
I think Morgan was next.
I couldn't agree more, and I'll put it in other words that thank you. I now have a working knowledge, and this was a great presentation. The subtext here is that we have more than we can manage, in my opinion. And I pulled up the charter again. I don't see anywhere in the charter that mandates staff to hold on. If we're running OSMP like a business within the perspective of we shouldn't try to do more than we have money for, I don't see anywhere in the charter that requires us to hold on to properties that don't have value, and that's subjective, where we truly don't and might never have money to maintain properties. So that's that. So if I'm wrong on the charter, I'd like to be educated on that. It doesn't need to happen today, but maybe that's a different conversation. I don't think there's anything holding us to holding on to things. And when I first joined the board weeks ago now, there were a lot of emails around disposal and claims that the charter prohibited any kind of disposal, and those are also opinions. But in future meetings, if we are looking at disposal, I'd like background too on what the real justification is, not just financial, but in terms of mandates. I think that's it for now, but I'm very sympathetic to the emotional attachment to these properties, very sympathetic to your job duties of making sure OSMP can sustain its functions. And I don't see holding on to these properties that really just cause consternation across the board as meeting the other charter provisions of conservation and preservation and access to open space. And I don't think these are a critical piece to that in my opinion. So I really echo what Brady said, and I just encourage us to keep on going, and the public comment that we get will be really constructive and helpful, but it shouldn't delay making some hard decisions.
Thank you, Morgan. Harmon?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I had something that I thought was relevant to what Brady was saying about taking it slow, and I think that we have a lot of tenant farmers, some of whom we have long-term relationships with and know really well, and one way to take it slow is to wait and see if one of those relationships turns into one where a farmer comes up to us and says, hey, I'm kind of tired of renting this property. What if I bought it? My my kid's 21 and he's just finishing college, and he actually told me the other day he wants to come back and be a farmer too. So suddenly we've got this great story to tell, that there's this generational farm family that we can give an ownership stake in an open space property to, and that there's not going to be any problem whatsoever in obtaining the kind of conservation easement protections that we need for the property, because they want to continue operating the property exactly as they have been as tenants. So things like that, just being open to those possibilities that might come up. I'm also, like Brady, not ready to just preclude disposal of a property or two. You know, if it looks like, getting rid of one property that has an extraordinarily problematic profile for us from a management or maintenance perspective, and has value to a private owner and can be protected through conservation easement or other language that's legally binding. And then that gives us a leg up on, an injection of capital into the program so that we can really do a better job managing the other properties. It wouldn't kill me to think that we went from 37 to 36 residential units that we own, and we are doing a much better job owning and maintaining the 36 because we got rid of the one problem child. In some ways, I didn't agree with the public comment around Hodges. I mean, Hodges is a roadside property with, in my mind, some questionable values. Not really significant open space recreation. Look at the open space purposes in section 176 of the charter, and holding Hodges doesn't seem that, superbly important to me. On the other hand, and Morgan, I hate to think that I'm here to per se educate you, but I could say that in response to your question about holding residential properties for open space purposes, you can easily make the connection in some of the open space purposes to a value for holding residential property, like in H, preservation of land for its aesthetic value or contribution of quality of life of the community. I think holding open space property for residential purposes and renting it to the local farmers can fall into that. We can control the aesthetic value of
Not all
a house.
37 though.
Well, yeah, but for one,
For one,
right?
yeah.
And
We agree. We're in agreement.
so, utilization of land for shaping the development of the city, limiting urban sprawl, preservation of ag uses and land suitable for agricultural production. Certainly you need farmers on site to preserve ag uses, or it helps. So I think you can fit the residential portfolio into at least 3 of the open space land purposes.
Thanks, Harmon. Sarah, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I had a question. Of the 9 million that requires updating and upgrades, how much of that is on the agricultural lands? Approximate.
That's a great question. That 9 million is across all the properties. So we'd have to look into the actual detailed condition assessments and reports for each structure to see just how much of that makes up the agricultural leased residences. But we could certainly get that level of detail for you. I don't have that immediately, like what comprises that 9 million, how much of that is agricultural based or focused.
Okay, yeah. To me, it seems like we have, what we do have is a real estate portfolio here. And these are important assets. And I know, and it stands outside of how we typically operate. So I think it's interesting that we're handing it off to a property management company. I mean, in my mind, if we're handing it off to a property management company, I'd like to be vesting them with the responsibility of helping us to ensure that our portfolio is optimized and functioning at its best, rather than paying fees to sort of maintain not even at baseline a portfolio. I mean, $9 million in backlogged repairs is compared relative to what was it, $350,000 a year in revenue from rent. That is, wow. I do think we really need to pay maybe a bit of more attention to this in general. And disposal is one one way to go about it, but I'm actually a bit more interested in what can we do to get this whole thing propped up and running better. And if disposal is really necessary on any particular property, then sure. I am, as you all know, very supportive of anything that we can do for our agricultural workers and our farm tenants. And I do know, I have seen firsthand how helpful it is for farmers to be able to recruit high level operators for their farms. This is something that we're providing for them that helps them to attract better farm workers. It's skilled. Being a farm, in order to be a farm worker, you have to have the skills of a good farm worker. So anything that we can do to be supporting the farmers is always good. But there's something here, just coming in with fresh eyes. It feels like one step removed is the best way that I can say it. And I wonder if there's a way to subsidize farmers through access to this affordable housing. I mean, this is very affordable. I got my calculator out and we're looking at like $987.65 on average per property if we're renting out 27 properties and making the total that I think I saw on that screen. So this is not, it is definitely below market, and we do have to subsidize those farmers, and it is very helpful for them to have this housing. So I don't want to blow that up by any means, but I'm just curious, like how we could maybe just refresh and approach this all differently so that our real estate portfolio and the assets that we have are being properly managed and taken care of in such a way that we can better serve and support the entire system, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I was just going to mention, a lot of the homes that we do have these residents, just like to go back. I mean, thank you, Sarah. Those were great comments and great kind of questions to kind of consider. That 9 million, it does go back to even like what Lauren was referencing in her portion, that as we acquire properties over the years and, it may have a home on there or a house, and it could have been vacant for years and left in disrepair or ruin, that we've had to now bring it into our portfolio and start to try to improve it. So that's why we say it's kind of a diverse and complex portfolio, because some of these might be pretty nice, homes that are ready to move in. Others are in very poor condition that we're just slowly chipping away at. And yeah, some of them might be agricultural facilities that we're trying to optimize for that use. But yeah, the property management, our goals are to kind of maintain the current homes that are in good condition and preserve that and continue to maintain while offering, housing for the workers and that sort of thing. But certainly some opportunities for optimization, improvement, and really looking at, kind of like what Harmon was saying, can we figure out a model where we're almost like an enterprise and really do this strategically and well. And then lastly, I think Dan might want to mention something too, but this is just one asset class among all of our assets across the system. In July, we're going to be up here talking about trails. We talk about irrigation infrastructure, trails, trailheads, etc. So we have to look across our system and start to prioritize and understand, like, okay, where do we put the limited funding? So that's always in the back of our minds too, of how we do it strategically.
It's out. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I don't want to interrupt you. I'll add, just from a real estate perspective, there's nobody at Open Space that takes disposal of land lightly. This is something that we take very, very seriously, our commitment to steward the land. And some of what y'all just raised is exactly what we've been wrestling with. And there have been times where we have something that's in disrepair and we actually have chosen to deconstruct it because that's what's best for the habitat block or the corridor or the financial management or whatever. We're really trying to look at exactly all of our asset classes, how we balance those out, what is the bigger picture of how we protect and steward the land, and where are these occasional places where we have an opportunity to maybe look at a different mechanism. So disposal is we have spent literal years talking about disposal before we brought Hodges to you as an example, for all of the reasons that you all just raised.
Yeah, I'll just make note too that the word disposal doesn't, it brings up this connotation of we're washing our hands clean of something and somebody else is going to either benefit from it or have the responsibility for it. In this case, what we're talking about is actually a transfer of the type of relationship we have with the property. So we're in this particular case, we were not going to abandon our relationship with the property. We were going to change the mechanism of what that relationship looks like, from a fee ownership to a conservation easement. I think most everybody in the community would be very proud of the 7,000 or 8,000 acres that are protected through conservation easements, and they view that as part of the open space family of protected lands. And so, yes, it's technically a disposal because of how disposals are sort of administered, but it's not a situation where we're washing our hands clean of something. We would be adding it to the conservation easement portfolio from the fee ownership. So I just want to clarify that because I think it's a complicated subject, and I think the word disposal is sort of used very broadly, and I think it's complicated. So
Yeah.
I think I understand. I think that I am now really understanding how important the PR is on this. I'm just going to call it PR, the public relations, and taking it slow, as was mentioned earlier. Um, because we had a presentation from Bosk today as well. I think this could be an interesting example of a public-private partnership where Conscience Bay locally, or some of the other, a couple of the developers in town are really committed to making Boulder. There's like a new generation right now that's working on what is Boulder, what is the future of Boulder, and there are developers in there. I wonder if A&B Bank, for example, that really cares about local projects, and some of these developers want to come together and help us get that $9 million and get these propped up. And perhaps it is embedded in a disposal conversation. I'm using parentheses around with my fingers. You can't see me, but maybe it's a both and. But I think this is such an interesting. We do have a real estate, an asset portfolio here, and we haven't really, as a board, to the other trustees, I think we've kind of. I'm just curious how we could maybe engage in this conversation a bit more creatively over time.
Sure.
I like Sarah's suggestion to, if this is brought back with a proposal or a different discussion item, just the context of the 37, which ones are in good condition, which one are in fair, which were just some like context to help us understand not the value, like the relative value or the use of different properties and their condition. Yeah. So I like that from Sarah. Thank you.
That's great.
And Lauren, if we had a good Sundance strategy, would that put us into the black?
It wouldn't hurt.
I was thinking the same thing. That's so funny.
if they're willing to help out on some of those agricultural lands while in between their movie watching. Yeah.
They need places to stay, for sure.
And that's
Hi,
part,
golly,
this is part of it. I think like optics and what was happening in the community at the time, right? Like when we're talking about having a BVCP conversation, housing affordability in this community, all of this, I think, played into, and democracy is messy. That's the whole point. I'm so glad the community told us what they thought of it. And now what do we do with all of that information? Yeah.
Yep. To echo what Sarah said, I think a lot of this is, messaging, and as we move forward, being more clear that this is a conservation easement discussion. Under the hood, technically it's a disposal, but I think helping the community understand what a conservation easement is and kind of talking about it more in that context, would really help get that message across. Morgan, to your point, like when I first joined the board, seeing that we had a residential portfolio was one of the things that had me kind of scratching my head and squinting at the charter, saying like, why do we do this? This doesn't really make sense. I will say that having gone and visited some of the residential properties, there was a dairy farm that we went and visited that has a house on it, and going and visiting and seeing that operation and that house and seeing the value that that family living there on the property on the dairy farm brought to the agricultural operation was really eye-opening to me. And I do think there are properties, particularly that are aligned with our agricultural properties, that, do meet open space purposes. But it's clear that there also may be some properties that are a drag on our portfolio that, may not serve those same open space purposes, like potentially the Hodges property. And, I would encourage us to keep these conversations going and, continue the discussion around conservation easements where we identify those properties that aren't necessarily serving open space purposes, and are kind of a drag on the portfolio where, we could still maintain the open space values with a conservation easement, but, kind of change our relationship with the property.
Can I clarify real quick? I want to keep most of them. I do, but
We do too.
my family owns 150-year-old outbuildings and farmhouses in the Midwest, and I fight to keep those up and up. But I want to encourage staff to keep moving forward with this and being strategic and methodical, and public input is one piece of the puzzle, and it's not a reason to stop. And thank you for clarifying the charter, but I think it could be read to mean anything if you look at it that way. But I do see the purpose in keeping them, and I believe in that, but I want to make sure I see it as a zero-sum game at this point, and I want to make sure we're conscientious of everything else in the charter too and being purposeful. So
Thanks, Morgan. All right.
Great.
I
Well,
think we're good.
valuable conversation. We got a lot, so thank you for the discussion. Appreciate that. All right. Oh, we're under my famous 5 minutes, and I actually have time tonight, so you're going to get me.
Look at that.
I just want to alert you to a couple of milestones and celebrations coming up. First, the Marshall Mesa Trailhead, as you all know, is up and running and being enjoyed. And I've a nice round of applause already from one of our trustees. But on May 31st, and some jazz hands, we're going to have sort of a grand opening with the community. And it's going to be from 9:30 to 10:30 on May 31st. And that's an opportunity to sort of, I guess, officially open it up. Well, unofficially, celebratory opening of and we would love to see out there. We'll be sure to send you an email reminder just with the times. But if some of you could come out and join us for that day, that would be fabulous. That is actually the same day, as you might recall from an earlier presentation of that evening. We're going to have that full moon jazz concert up at the amphitheater in order to benefit Bosque. Finally, I just want to conclude tonight that some good news is that we just got word that we have earned, the department has earned the Leave No Trace Gold Standard site designation from the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics. And it really is 12 organizations were honored with that gold standard nationally. So it's quite an honor for open space to be selected to be amongst those 12, which is sort of just exemplifying leadership and how we protect natural areas through education, stewardship, and sustainable management. And this is all leading toward a little bit of a celebration of that gold standard selection. And that is on June 7th at 10 a.m. on Sunday at the Chautauqua Trailhead. There is going to be a celebration of that gold standard designation. So we will again put you out an email reminder of that, but just really proud of what it goes into for meeting all those sort of standards of how we welcome people onto our open space system, as well as encourage responsible recreation. So that kind of goes hand in hand. So with that, those are my updates for y'all.
All right. Thanks, Dan. With that, we're adjourned.